from. Welcome and thanks for tuning in today to what's a very important conversation on race, privilege and football. My name's Moya Dodd and I'm standing in this morning for our moderator Asma Halal, who sadly suffered a family bereavement yesterday. So she's with her family today and our thoughts and best wishes are with her. But meantime, you have her understudy, which is me, but you also have some top-notch guests who I'll introduce shortly. This is more than just a conversation. This is a chance to learn, to listen, to self-reflect, and hopefully to inspire and to act. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people in the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to all First Peoples who have tuned in today. Next, some housekeeping. Today's discussion is hosted by Women On Side, and we've got team members Julie Ryan and Helen Tarikos, who are the backroom angels, as I call them. They will manage the Q&A and the tech during the session. We're keeping the chat room function open, and we invite you to ask questions to the panel. Please keep them concise and focused, if you would, and please indicate who you would like the question to be directed to. Just pop their name in brackets or write all if it's directed to everybody. We might not get to all of them, but we'll certainly do our best to identify the common threads and make sure that we cover as many topics as we can. Women On Side are recording this presentation, so if you have enabled your camera and you're visible to other participants, then you will also be on the recording. If you don't want that to happen, then please turn your camera off. You can find the video mute button usually on the bottom left of your Zoom screen. So to warm us up now and make sure you're all here and present, we're throwing up a poll question. So you should see the poll. Have you personally experienced racism? Has someone you know experienced racism? Is racism a problem in Australia?
Because a couple of others have logged in as Women On Side, it's not appearing for me. Julie or Maria, can you try putting the poll? We might have to let it go.
Here we go. I've got the, well, I can see it. I hope you others can. Okay, so please give us your answers to the poll. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are coming into this session. A few not so fun facts here. 1 in 5 people living in Australia have been the target of racial discrimination. That's about 4.6 million people. 2 in 5 have been a target of verbal racial abuse, and 3 in 4 Indigenous Australians regularly experience racism. So that's some survey data. We'll have a look at our poll results when it closes and see what how your views stack up with that. But now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We've got 3 terrific speakers today on this subject. First, Shireen Ahmed. Shireen is a writer, public speaker, mentor and award-winning sports activist. That's a pretty cool title, award-winning sports activist. She focuses on women and the intersection of race and misogyny in sport. She's a part of the Burn It All Down Feminist Sports podcast team, and she is frequently sought by major media outlets for her expertise and her commentary. Welcome, Shireen, all the way from Toronto. We also have Bruce Chate, who I'm sure you know is a former Socceroo. He's played for clubs in Turkey, China, South Korea, Indonesia, and of course Australia, where he's won all the domestic trophies with Adelaide United, including the double in 2016. And he tops the list as the club's record goal scorer. Bruce also spent over 4 years on the Exec and Governance Committee of the PFA, Professional Footballers Australia, and he's currently Adelaide United Director of Football. So welcome, Bruce. And we have Jade North, the only ever Indigenous captain of the Socceroos, and also the first Indigenous captain to raise a national trophy in a football code in Australia. He's a proud Indigenous man from the Biripi people in Taree in northern New South Wales. You probably also recognise him from his time with Brisbane Roar. or maybe you saw one of his 41 appearances for the Socceroos, or his appearances in the Olympics. That was twice. And you might have seen him win the A-League Championship a couple of times as well. So since hanging up his boots, he founded a Indigenous football program designed to inspire kids to make a better life and to increase their participation in football. That program is called Kicking with a Cuz. And big welcome to you, Jade North. So to kick off our conversation, I'd like to start with Shireen to set the scene. Shireen, you're sitting in Toronto. You're looking down, so to speak, on the US, where we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement unfold and have a great impact in sport as well. Shireen, talk to us a bit about racism and privilege and why it's important for us to be discussing this today.
Thank you, Moya, and hello, or good day, as you say. Good evening here. I just wanted to say, first of all, that I'm very appreciative. And although I'm not Australian, I've never visited Australia. One of the key themes of today is sort of understanding how white supremacy and forms of systems of oppression, including racism, they mirror each other in their effect all over the world. And I think this is very important for everybody to understand. Canada suffers from its own mistreatment of Black communities, Indigenous communities. And when I met with Jade and Bruce earlier this week or last week, so much of what they said resonated here. And that's what I'm going to say, is just that I really firmly believe that it's important to understand why the conversations should be had in football, conversations that we shouldn't shy away from. We need to talk in the language, in my opinion. I'm a scribe professionally, and words are very important to me. And I don't think we need to tiptoe around things. Saying end racism is actually quite vague. Using things like combating anti-Blackness is more specific, not tolerating anti-indigeneity. We must say no to homophobia. We must not be complicit in misogyny. These things are really important to say. The world can handle it. The soccer community can handle it. We need to be able to have these conversations and even differentiate to why. I mean, if we want to get into specifically why words matter, the example of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Some people will say, well, wait a minute, aren't all lives important? Okay, but that's not the point of Black Lives Matter, because at the point there's a crisis, not just in the United States, but it manifests all over the world in different forms of colonialism and imperialism as well. I mean, you can't just argue that Black Lives Matter only affects the United States, because we saw it resonate all over the place. We saw it resonate in Europe. We saw it resonate in different parts of Asia even. I think it's important to understand that. And getting back to what I was saying, all lives matter. Nobody is saying that people's lives aren't important and they're not valued, but that's exactly the point of Black Lives Matter. I'm a non-Black woman of color, and I understand how pervasive anti-Blackness is. My own community, I'm from a South Asian, Central Asian background, and I'm a Muslim woman who's identifiable. My community suffers from anti-Blackness because it's very much the root of so many evils. And again, Black Lives Matter is just trying to reiterate that the way that Black communities have been treated is unacceptable. And it doesn't only mean that it's just Black people that are important. Correlating adjacent communities also matter. The struggles of Indigenous folks are also very highly recognized. And I think that that's extremely important to remember. So many of the struggles of marginalized communities are connected. So when you are from a community and you're a woman, you're from a trans community, or from a Muslim community, a Jewish community, it doesn't matter. When you say Black Lives Matter, you are not saying Black lives are more important than everyone else. You are simply saying they matter, period. So people sort of have to get over this idea that in raising one, we're not pushing down another. We're just trying to make everybody equal.
Thanks, Shireen, for framing that. We might share the poll results that we did just a little earlier. 25% of people on this webinar have personally experienced racism, and everybody knows someone and everybody thinks it's a problem in Australia. So I guess that's not surprising since you bothered to show up to a webinar on a Saturday morning, but thanks for participating in the poll. And also I'd like to thank all of you for coming, but in particular those who are involved in football governance. We've got some fairly high-level people who've joined this, so I'd like to thank Sunil Gulati for joining. He's a member of the FIFA Council. We've got a couple of board members from the Australian FFA, Heather Reid and Robin Fitzroy, Fran Sankey from Capital Football. So a big thank you to those in football governance for taking the time to ensure that these views can be carried into the decision-making room, and thank you for doing that. A couple of other shout-outs while we're welcoming you all. Some former Matildas are here. Welcome Sarah, Trina, former Socceroo, Gary, thanks for joining. The Muslim Women in Sports Network. There are many of Shireen's contacts from around the world. Desiree Ellis, the coach of South Africa, former player, is also on our webinar. And I'd like to make one special shout out to Kelly Nascimento. So if that name sounds familiar, it's because Kelly is the oldest daughter of Pele. And if this is the closest you ever get in your life to Pele, then it will have been a morning well spent. So welcome to Kelly, who's dialing in from New York. I'd like to turn now to some of the personal stories that our panelists have. And turning first to you, Jade. You're an Indigenous kid, you were born in Taree. Tell us a little bit about your personal experiences of growing up as an Indigenous kid, and then especially as you came into football more prominently and started to shine at the elite level. Tell us what that was like for you.
Yeah, just I was born in Taree, mid-North Coast, sort of northern New South Wales, and back in those days, living in an Indigenous community, I was living in a housing commission as well, where, you know, my family, we didn't have much money at all. And yeah, the problems, so my mum separated from my dad at a young age because of the fact that she didn't want us growing up and seeing the things like alcohol. There was domestic violence, drugs associated within these Indigenous communities and the underprivileged people. And we moved from Taree up to Queensland. So I was quite fortunate that I moved up to Queensland, and that's when I took up the passion of soccer and of football, soccer, however we call it here in this country. But had I not moved away up to Queensland, you know, life would have been a lot different because, you know, I've got cousins that play rugby league. It's a stronghold rugby league town. My dad's uncles, they were into boxing and all that sort of stuff. So to play football, you know, a lot of my cousins and a lot of the Indigenous community still today, they're like, why'd you choose the round ball game? It was only because of the path that my mum chose for an opportunity to move away and to create a better life for ourselves. So it was hard growing up with a single mother and, you know, not having a lot of money, couldn't afford boots, couldn't afford, you know, to go to football camps and all this sort of stuff. And sometimes it was hard to even have food in the cupboards at times, you know. So go back to my story about moving to Queensland. The reason that I chose to play football, because my friends at school down the Gold Coast, they all played soccer. So I fell in love with the game. I played it, and I joined the club, Burleigh Bulldogs, back in the day. And from there, you know, it just showed me, you know, being a part of a team and being part of an organisation that, you know, for the first time, you know, in my life, I felt a part of something, you know, because growing up as an Indigenous young person, you know, you hear a lot of, you know, where you're from, and you're quite embarrassed at the times because, you know, people, because I'm an Indigenous person, they look down upon you. And I carried that along with me, you know, up until I was probably 18, 19. So had it not been for football, and I was doing really, really well through all the grades, through under 13s, 14s, all the way through the reps, and then playing for Sydney Olympic back in the old NSL. And when I was doing well as a team, that all took me in, and I was winning championships when I was on the National Soccer League. And that was the time that I felt, you know, I'm going to come out and be proud of who I am and really try to leave a little bit of a, be a role model to younger people, even though I was 19. And that was the first time I officially sort of come out and sort of said that I was an proud Indigenous young man, and proud of who I was and where I come from. So, it took a lot. There was a lot of anxiety, that led to depression, later in life. Not growing up with your family, for various reasons, and I didn't get to meet my dad and a lot of my Indigenous side of the family until I was sort of 18. So you can imagine, as a young person, not knowing who you are, your identity, you're ashamed of who you are, and all these little bits and pieces, that really you carry these scars along the way. But had it not been for football, everyone, that's the reason I loved football. I stayed with it. And when people back at school, they're going to parties, they wanted to go and do this, I was always tucked away in bed on a Friday night, because I was looking forward to my game. And in the morning, even when I was 8, 9, 10, up until I got to my mid-teens, So sport for me was a connector, not only for a better life, but it was for opportunity and mateship. I've still got friends from when I was back at 8, 9 years old. Now we're all connected on social media, So for me, sport is such a connector, and I believe it can really springboard people to do anything. The sky's the limit, and if you believe in what you want and dream, and I always dreamed as a little kid I wanted to be a professional footballer. And coming from an Indigenous little community in Taree, people look back and go, now that I speak in front of corporates and things like that, people are gobsmacked, because if you knew the story about me, I've got brothers and sisters that are in and out of jail. I've got cousins, that have aunties that are overdosed on heroin. And, there's a lot of alcohol, drugs, all this sort of stuff. So when I talk about it, people are gobsmacked, because this is my life and this is what I know. And I guess, when I'm so honest about who I am and where I'm from, I think it's very endearing for people. And it's good, because then I can sort of help the younger generation come through as well. And football's made me who I am today. So I'm proud to be an Indigenous person of this country, and I'm proud to be on this conversation with everyone. So that's just a little bit of a background of where I am and what I'm doing, but I'll certainly answer some more questions in a little bit.
Thanks for sharing all that, Jade. You've got an enormous number of admirers in Australia from watching you play football, but I think knowing more about your background is really something that helps us understand what a struggle it's been for you to get there, and how much you did to create that opportunity, and your acknowledgement of football as part of that. But I just want to, you mentioned your father, and I think you told me he was a member of the Stolen Generation, which for those who are dialing in from elsewhere, was the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their parents to be put in sort of institutional settings and brought up in the white way, I suppose. Jade, do you want to tell us a little more about that and reflect upon the situation of those who are members of the Stolen Generation?
Yeah, like my dad and all of his brothers and sisters were removed, and they had to grow up with white family, and it was because they were so close, as any family are growing up, and you could imagine, like, if anyone was to come and grab my kids and take them away, it'd be heartbreaking, and these are the things that my dad and his brothers and sisters have to, still today have to deal with. And but the good thing is, when you go back down to Taree, all the families back together again, so they were never ever going to get separated in that regard. They were going to be there within spirit, or however it was going to be. They're always going to find each other later. But, and look, it was tough for them. They didn't even back in Taree, back in the late 60s, early 70s, they weren't even, to be able to cross the bridge in the Manning River. Bridge to go into Taree, into the city. They weren't even allowed to sort of do that back in the day. So, that's not recognised as human in my regard. But these are the things that we've had to deal with, and there's a lot of anger. And I suppose that's what, from generations back, there's that sort of anger that gets passed down to the next generation and the next generation. So there is a bit of anger. And, but like I said earlier, a couple of weeks ago, I think we wouldn't be Australia today if it wasn't, look, Australia's got a dark history. We get that, and that's coming out more and more. But also, I believe that, we are who we are today. And that's one thing that I like to sort of teach people as well, because I think us as humans, we can always educate people on what happened in the past. And, I've experienced a lot of racism through my being at school when I was younger, and obviously on the football pitch as well. And, and it's some young people that are yelling the abuse as well. And I see it as that's been passed down from their family. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's just uneducated. But look, it is what it is. And, my family still have to sort of, that's just one of the problems that they have to deal with. And, it would have been a horrible experience to be separated from your family.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Jade. There's some comments coming in through the chat that you might like to read if people are appreciative of your story. Bruce Jutay, I want to come to you now. We're all used to seeing you banging in goals and being the number 9. But of course, as a black man living in Australia, your experience hasn't always been one of adulation and having a lot of fans. Tell us a little more of your personal experience. You were born in America, but tell us a little bit about how you finished up being a black man in Australia and your experience of that from a personal perspective.
Yeah, so thanks, Moya. Born in the States, in Arlington. My father was a lecturer at Georgetown University. Got a job offer from Sydney University and shifted the family to Australia. After hearing Jade's story, I feel like I'm one of the privileged, funnily enough. We grew up in an area where people were quite well educated. We went to very good schools and the like. So a lot of the challenges that I see today in a lot of refugees coming, the South Sudanese, there's quite a influx of them over the last several years, and as well as, people from Middle East backgrounds, considering all the conflict in those areas in the world, we've received quite a few refugees. And, I look at them and my story is quite different to theirs. We decided to come here. We were lucky or privileged enough to grow up amongst quite well-educated people. I don't personally have any, horror racism stories, but what I will say is it was abundantly clear, that we were the only black family. For anyone who knows Sydney, basically from the Harbour Bridge all the way out north to Hornsby, I didn't know any other black family or people living in that area. It's quite an expansive one. So a good example is I tell people, when you go to a big dinner or a big gala and you sit on that big table of 10 with a white cloth, if you get a black pen and put a dot in it, that's how I felt growing up, because there was no one else who looked like me. And personally, I like to use any experience I have to fuel the fire in my belly for a positive reaction. Playing football was immense for me. The time I felt most myself or comfortable within my own skin, if you like, is when I was playing, often going out to Western Sydney, the heartland of football in this country, to play games with the Marconis of the world and the Sydney Uniteds. And I took comfort from being around people who spoke different languages. Their first language was a language other than English. They ate their native food, even if they weren't black, just that they were different to your typical Australian, which is what I was surrounded by, was when I was the most comfortable. I don't say I was uncomfortable at school. Being good at sport in this country is a massive benefit when it comes to, schoolyard popularity and the like. But what I will say is I knew I was different, and it drove me to be better. I'm sure there's many people on this call that will know when, I don't know, I think it's a migrant thing, you know, when you're different, you know, it's always like every day you got to prove yourself to be better and worthy of your place in this community or society or whatever. And while that's not good, and society was better and more inclusive, and we didn't have these issues of racism and the like, you know, it'd be a better place. But also I tried to use that to better myself, you know, to strive to exceed expectations and all the rest. So that's what I'd say about my growing up in Australia. I don't have any horror stories. I think as I got older and entered the professional football scene, you see it a lot more. You know, people try to tear you down with racial abuse. And the sad thing is, even now in my position, you know, I'm often contacted by schools who want me to go speak to their students because, you know, their football team was racially abused by another school, or, you know, there's an Ethiopian kid at a school, he's been adopted. He goes to a very elite private school and they're not quite fitting in. And, you know, I'm going to go address them in the next week or two. So certainly a problem that's persistent and continues on.
Thanks, Bruce. There, of course, are a lot of African migrants and refugees in Australia now. And as you walk down the street or as you walk into Highmarsh Stadium, you won't look a lot different to them necessarily. So you must have perhaps experienced some of the reactions that Australians give to people who are migrants because they think you are one. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Yeah,
certainly. You know, I think the difference, and you know, Australia is a country made up of multiple migrants, you know, over generations. I think the difference in being black or you know, is the fact that you actually look different. So whilst you may not be Australian, if you're white, then no one knows that you're different to start speaking and you've got an accent or something like that. But unfortunately, you know, people still judge on appearance. For example, I'd never put my photo on a CV or resume. You know, I just wouldn't do that. And the fact that that's still in my mind lets you know a little bit about how much further we need to go. So yeah, it's only after you start speaking, and it's interesting in Adelaide, obviously, I'm relatively well known. I'm treated differently. If I'm in Perth or Sydney or Brisbane, another city where I'm not known at all, then I get a better understanding and a better feeling of, you know, what it really is like to, you know, I sort of live in a bit of a bubble in Adelaide. You know, it's when I'm outside of this city that you get that sense of, you know, you are different. To start speaking and you've got an Aussie accent and okay, you know, I don't know what the thought process is. You know, he's been here for a long time. He's one of us, or what have you. But certainly, and there's different ways. It's not just the abuse and everything else. It's also, you know, you go to nice stores. You know, people might follow you around. You know, the immediate, and this not everyone. I'm obviously generalizing here, but there's been instances where you know that you know that shop assistant or whatever thinks you're going to steal something, or, you know, why is that guy in this shop? Or, you know, a lot of times while I played, I wore trackies. I was sponsored by Nike. You know, I wore trackies every day when I was a player. Doesn't mean you don't go to nice places, but, you know, wearing trackies, black guy, hoodie, you know, and you've seen in America, it's much worse there, but unfortunately, for many reasons, you know, Australia is a big follower of the United States in terms of society and pop culture and all the rest, and that filters through here as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all that, Bruce, and giving us those perspectives. I mean, when you look at disadvantage, sometimes there's layers of it, and what you've just shown us is you know, you had a good education and, you know, you lived in a nice area, but nonetheless, and that kind of exposed the racism for what it is, because it wasn't due to any other reason. It's just simply a matter of colour. And as you point out, you never have to come out as black, right? It's something that's
pretty clear.
It's very visible to everyone. But speaking of layers and I guess intersectionality, Shireen, I want to come to you and hear a little more about your life story of experiencing discrimination as a person of colour, but also some of the other issues that you raised in your opening. Tell us a little about your life.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jade and Bruce, for sharing that. I just wanted to also reiterate something that Bruce had said about, I too came from privilege. I had very educated, overly educated parents that were immigrants to Canada. And I think the thing is that racialized communities and marginalized communities experience racism in a variety of ways. It doesn't always come out the same. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Not every community or every person that's racialized will have the same experience. The first time I was ever racially abused, and Bruce, when you're talking about a dot on a tablecloth, I grew up in a coastal Canadian city called Halifax. I went, and to make it more fun, my parents put me in a French school because they wanted me to be even more different. And I appreciate being multilingual because I am. But, you know, speaking 4 languages fluently is helpful, but it's also very isolating. So, you know, for one thing, when I go to places, people don't think I speak English, forget about any other language. And, you know, we can talk about that in different ways. Football for me was a place where I could belong. I was very gregarious, and, you know, my parents wanted to, my mother in particular was very excited. She, you know, played table tennis and was a champion of her medical college in Pakistan, so was very keen. My father was an oarsman in Karachi, Pakistan, who wasn't allowed to row crew because he wasn't white. So he had to scull by himself. So the experience that I had was of parents who had to fight, my mother because she was a woman, and my father because he was, even in his hometown, he couldn't row. So when he moved to Canada, they were like, we don't care what color you are as long as you pull hard, which doesn't mean that he didn't experience racism later. It just meant in that sphere, he was lucky. So for me, football was a place that it made sense to me. The game made sense to me. I, you know, was good at putting the ball in the back of the net. So I did that. I felt blended in because I stood out very much. And I think that there's a way that we aspire, and then we can lose ourselves in the match. We can lose ourselves in that moment. And I love what Jade said about football and soccer being a connector, because I really think it is. I don't think it transcends race, but I think it connects different communities. That's why we see it as a form of therapy used in refugee camps around the world. That sport is often used like that. And I think these are like as a modality, in fact. And I chose to cover when I was playing for the University of Toronto in uni, and it was a big surprise to everybody because deciding to wear a headscarf was just something that came one day. It was a process. It wasn't long. No, I didn't speak to anyone about it. I didn't seek permission from my father or my brother or the local imam because it wasn't their business or body. It was mine. And I was lucky to be able to make that decision. When I say lucky, I was I was brought up to believe it was my choice. It was my faith. It was my relationship. I was going to do it. And I recognize that not everybody has that experience. I'm talking about mine. I am not the representative for all Muslim women in the world. So please don't think that what I'm saying is the same. We're not a monolith. So wearing hijab as a footballer was very interesting because I didn't realize at the time FIFA didn't have any sound rules against it. And I'm aging myself, but we're talking like 97, 98. There was no rules that you couldn't wear a hijab. That would come later in 2007. But there was no rules that I could. And those are familiar with FIFA. FIFA loves rules of all kinds and policies and whatnot. I can defer to others on this call that know more. But what ended up happening was I would suit up for matches and the referees would then decide that no. So one of the reasons I came into journalism is because I started following the story of hijab ban in football. And I hung up my boots. I had children and it was fine. I played when I could, coached when I could. But this always bothered me. And I spent years contacting federations, emailing them, asking about whether kippah, turbans, and hijabs were in fact an impediment, if there was any proof, because I had a very strong suspicion that banning hijabs and kippah and turbans was just a power move, and there was no basis for it, and I was correct. I spent a long time looking for that information, and it didn't in fact exist because I couldn't find on record, and I contacted over 16 federations or globally that couldn't tell me that hijab had actually hurt someone else. There was a lot of jewelry that had caused injury, or hair, for example, but nothing specifically about a hijab and asphyxiation. So that's how I came to come more full cycle, and it brought me back to journalism. It brought me into reporting because, and we probably will get into this, media reports very poorly, particularly in racialized communities, and particularly on issues within sport, because the media industry that I'm a part of in North America, and I would say Europe, but I know specifically the North American statistics. I'm in an industry where 90% of my colleagues are white, able-bodied, straight men. So that's the reality of where I am. So when you think about the lens of whom is writing these stories, what their focus is, the way they're speaking about communities, that's why I specifically got into it, because I didn't like the way it was being done. So then I found out about a super group, and thus began my love of Australia, where some people heavily advocating for overturning a hijab ban. And I mean, Asma cannot be with us, and our hearts are with her this evening, but she was part of a group of superheroes. Moya Dodd is one of them as well, who really were guardians of the game and were opening it up. And there's a whole team of people, including Prince Ali Hussein of Jordan, but who really rallied to understand why this was happening. And eventually the ban was overturned in 2014. But all of this to say that this affected me profoundly, because there's generations of footballers that didn't get an opportunity. They didn't get it to get a chance to play. They didn't get the glory that I had experienced. They didn't get a chance to play at the levels that they would have liked. I'm not saying that I would have gone professional or semi-professional. Let's be quite honest. I played left bench in university. So, but the point is that I didn't get the opportunity to, and these things concern me. And these things are actually, like it or not, as someone who studied this and who's like, I've chronicled these stories, there's a system and a pattern of discrimination here, racialized discrimination. And it's important that we write it down. And right now, to be very honest, I am one of the few journalists that's constantly on a story. And although we celebrated, and I was in France last year celebrating the Women's World Cup, and we love women's football. I love the Matildas. But how many people in Australia actually are aware that there's still a country in the world, despite FIFA overturning a ban, that doesn't permit Muslim women in scarves to participate in football, and that country is France. So while I'm in France celebrating football, I'm also with Fairnet, an organization based out of the UK and in Europe that seeks to sort of study and talk about and have campaigns against racial discrimination, homophobia, and sexism. I'm talking about how much it hurts to be in a place where still football is not allowed for specific community of women. That's ongoing. That happens now. Even professional footballers who are women don't even know that this exists necessarily. So, I mean, there's, as much as we love football and we want to uplift it, I love it, but I need to critique it in a way that these are systems of discrimination that are ongoing. And, you know, France is not easy to battle with on the pitch or off the pitch when it comes to politics. So, you know, I gotta roll my sleeves up tight in my hijab and get going. And this is part of my life story. I tell you all this because it comes full circle for me. I'm a journalist, but I'm a journalist who's a sports person who covers Muslim women in sports. It's very, very much up my alley and my wheelhouse. So that's a little bit of what it is. Just a little bit, Moya.
Thanks, Shireen. You can probably all tell that she's also a podcaster. So if you want to hear more of Shireen, you can subscribe to the Burn It All Down podcast, which a few of us have been listening to for a while, and certainly commands attention and shines light into many of the corners of the games that you don't hear about in mainstream media. Thanks for sharing all that. I mean, it certainly is a perspective that I didn't personally understand until the hijab issue landed on my desk when I was part of AFC. And you and Asma were both people who gave me a good deal of education on the matter. So thank you for educating me and helping to change all of this. I want to come back to Australia now and talk a little bit about the context here that Jade and Bruce both touched on, to do with club football. I think we all understand that Australia's history, I mean, it's said to have, you know, three phases. One is the pre-European phase, where for 65,000 years, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were custodians of the land, did a very good job of looking after it. Then a little over 200 years ago, we had a lot of Europeans arrive. So we had white colonisation by the British, and then we had a lot of particularly post-war migration from Europe and elsewhere in the world. And I think it's that third phase which is probably formed the football society that most of us grew up in, where there were a lot of clubs who were formed around migrant groups that were had been social clubs, formed football clubs, and that was what created the pillars of strength in Australian football through those decades. They've been described in Joe Gorman's book, The Death and Life of Australian Soccer, as football being a respite, a place to be treated with respect and dignity. But perhaps to the rest of Australia, to the white Australia, and let's remember we had a policy about white Australia for a long time, to the rest of Australia, it was seen as a bit of a threat to that white Australia policy and a threat to assimilation. So my questions are, especially for Jade and Bruce, maybe to throw in their thoughts on the discussion, is this still the case today? Do you see clubs at all levels as playing that role of kind of nurturing people who might not feel they fit in elsewhere? And then how do we kind of reconcile that with the integration of clubs into a broader game that creates, you know, pathways to the top for people from all walks of life? Do you think we're able to do that effectively? What are your reflections and perspectives on the role of clubs now? Maybe I'll start with you, Bruce, because you're sitting there as a director of football at Adelaide United.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting space. I'm also on the advisory board of an organisation called Welcoming Clubs, which is born out of Welcoming Australia, not-for-profit group, all about inclusiveness, diversity, and the like. And look, I think there's nuances in everything. I think it's important that, and I know in Australia we had, you know, ethnic clubs, if you like, where, you know, you had Melbourne Knights, Melbourne Croatia, you know, you had, you know, Greek clubs, Italian clubs, Marconi. You know, I played at Marconi for a number of years, a big Italian club in the west of Sydney. Proud history, really proud of their heritage, you know, green, white and red everywhere. I think they have a place because these clubs were created. It's like a home for people who would have felt like me growing up, you know, would have felt like Shireen. Well, I'm in Halifax in Canada and no one looks like me, you know. I'm in Kalara in Sydney and no one looks like me. You know, and these different diasporas, they congregate at that club and it reminds them of home. Now, obviously, in more recent history, the Football Federation of Australia thought that they took the view that, you know, if you've got a club that's you know, got this sort of subculture, you know, we're all Australians, so why should, you know, a club be called Melbourne Croatia and have the red and white checkered sort of flag or symbolism? You know, they wanted to get rid of that on the argument, correct me if I'm wrong, Moya, that actually excludes non-Croatians from going to that club. What they, I think, failed to understand is the fact that no, that's a welcoming space, and you know what? They do welcome others. I'm the perfect example. You know, the Italians at Marconi were the first people to wrap their arms around me and make me feel like one of theirs and teach me the language and, you know, taught me to eat spaghetti with a fork and a spoon, and all the other sort of cultural beauties that you get from those clubs. So I think there's an important, very important piece that they play. I think it's important that they're allowed to be themselves and celebrate their cultures, because at the end of the day, Australia is a fantastic mix of hundreds of thousands of cultures, right? So they play an important role. I know here in South Australia, there's a big African Cup where all the different African diasporas will come together on a long weekend, normally in October, and there'll be 6,000 people that come to watch these games over 2 days. I think it's the biggest event that Football South Australia helps to host. It's massive, right? So if you're in Team Ethiopia, it's not saying that, oh, if you're not Ethiopian, you can't hang with us. It's just them celebrating their country, their culture, their food, their dance, everything, and it plays a very, very important role. I reckon the first week I took this job, I had the African Communities Council come and meet with me about this tournament. It was that big a deal. And how Adelaide United, as a professional football club, which had never been involved in that tournament prior, how we could get involved, how we could motivate those kids. And, I'm well aware of the responsibility I have in my role, but also as a Black individual. Similar to Shireen, it was my parents and their parents who did the real struggle for us to be here. So I feel a responsibility to stand on those guys' shoulders and really be a role model to the younger generation, or the refugees, or the ones doing it tough. And every now and then when I get stopped in the street and they say, oh, we're so proud of what you're doing, or keep doing what you're doing, or great work with this or that, it really resonates with them, and I'm well aware of that. So look, in short, those clubs have a space, an important space, and it's a safe space for people to be themselves, as opposed to trying to be what they think society wants them to be.
Thanks, Bruce. Jade, I'd be interested in your perspectives. I mean, we know there were some very prominent Aboriginal footballers in the early days, Charles Perkins, John Moriarty, of course, and I think John is the one who was reported as saying that, we were treated as equals in soccer, whereas everywhere else in Australia, we weren't counted in the census until a certain point in time, and so on. At the same time, when you look at sport in Australia, the racism is still pretty evident, and especially I think we all were struck by the case of Adam Goodes in Australian rules, and the quite shocking experience that he had, even as probably the best player in the league, was suffering shockingly at the hands of fans, and really nobody did a thing about it until it was far too late. What are your reflections on the role that clubs can play, whether it is a safe sanctuary now for kids, whether it's accessible for Indigenous kids to be a part of that, and your reflections, especially on some of the thoughts that Bruce has put forward?
Yeah, I'll touch on what Bruce was saying. I started my NSL, the National Soccer League, up here in Brisbane. And the old days with John Cosmeta was my coach, and a lot of the team, they were sort of like I was an Indigenous. We had a PNG boy, and the rest were, European or white background, So, and then my second club after that, I moved to Sydney with Sydney Olympic, the Olympic Sharks back in the day. And that was fantastic. They took me in like I was, they called me the Brisbane Bullet back at the time, because I could run pretty fast back in the day, but not these days. But you know what I mean? And they just loved their culture. They wanted to bring me into their club and who they represented and their passion. And it was quite funny, because when the old NSL, the National Soccer League, when it folded and was coming into the new A-League, all those old clubs had been they felt like they'd lost their identity. So they went back to their clubs within the state that they were from, and continued on. And it wasn't until I played Western Sydney away one time, and you know, they had a great support base, and it was an intimidating place to go down and play at Old Parramatta Stadium, you know, with the RBB and all the support crew, and it was a fantastic environment, football environment. And then I'd look over to this, you know, when I think it was Western Sydney scored or something like that, I'm looking over to the side there. Next minute, all the Sydney Olympic boys were all wearing the Western Sydney jerseys, but then underneath they had the Sydney Olympic jersey, you know. So to me, it showed the old NSL coming into the new A-League, but it took a little while for that to sort of come across. And then, you know, I think everyone's has bought into the A-League, which has been great, because, like Bruce said, then the people from the old thought that their identities were getting taken away, which I totally understand. But also, I could see where the A-League were trying to go to be more inclusive, but people still felt they weren't part of something. So it's just great. That was just an example to see that these nutcases from the support crew from Sydney Olympic, they were Western Sydney supporters supporting Western Sydney on a Saturday, but then they'd be watching their team, Sydney Olympic, on the Sunday, you know. So I thought that was great. And just to go on a little bit of what we're doing in Australia, you know, I play for Eastern Suburbs here in the NPL. It's coached by Danny Wright, and an old NSL player. And they've been fantastic in the terms of, you know, me being Indigenous and what I can help to bring, not only as a player for the young boys and the club and the culture as a whole, but, you know, we've got a few African boys. They want to tap into Indigenous, you know, help pay for their registrations and help bring them, because it's a family club. And there's a few, and we want to set the example. I know there's a lot of clubs out there that are providing these, you know, opportunities. And just the other day, I went and visited my old Sunnybank High School up here in Brisbane that I attended, and they made the Metropolitan Final the other day, which is the first time ever. And I'd say 90% of that team were from the Middle East. They had African backgrounds, and they some of them come from refugee sort of backgrounds as well. And for me to be there was great. I really, it was something special. And I saw some great talent. They played against a team that trained 3 times. It was a sporting excellence school. And it was quite funny to have a look. You know, the excellence school was made up of white, and the Sunnybank High School was all African and Middle Eastern. So it was quite interesting to see, you know, where the two teams sort of come to, but they met in the final, you know. So it was great to sit back and watch that for once. And yeah, and after that, I've just got a lot of messages from the boys going, Jade, can you get me a club in Brisbane? Where is it? Where can I go? How do I pursue it? You know, so just great. And I guess we're back to East, what we're trying to do there. And you know, I think me being an Indigenous role model and an ex-player is to try to provide pathways. And how you going, Glenn Warrior? I saw you put a message out there before, and Glenn's sort of touched on it. I know he's been working hard in the background, working with Indigenous and and underprivileged, trying to help with pathways. And I guess, you know, in the past, it's been hard because we just haven't had the right framework. We haven't had the right plan and the strategies behind it. But now with James Johnson coming on, and Sarah Walsh, I know she's on here as well. It's great that we're trying to, you know, bring the Indigenous community together, and also that the underprivileged, and how can we make it affordable for these young kids that want to play the game. Because me growing up, I couldn't afford to go to these camps that we used to have, you know, under 12s, 13s, 14s. I think it was $300 back in the day. You know, my mum couldn't afford it. She had to work 2-3 jobs, you know, just to keep food on the table. And, you know, hadn't we got that money to go, I wouldn't have been able to go to these camps to continue on to be who I am today. So, look, and the thing is, we've got so many codes in Australia, and we're very blessed, and we're lucky to have, you know, the AFL, rugby league, you know, cricket, swimming, you know, we've got everything, and football, soccer falls in there somewhere. And I guess I think the fees are quite high at the moment, and I think we just got to work to try and get some framework, because what tends to happen, a lot of these kids, I know a lot of NRL players, and they played soccer. And Bruce, you probably know a few AFL boys over your way that played soccer all the way growing up until they get to 12, 13, and they just go to the other codes because they've been around long enough. They've got the right programs put in place. And I feel like with soccer in this country, it's filtered. We've got to from the grassroots up, whereas NRL, AFL, they get funded from the top down. So to give you an example, my son, he was playing rugby league on a Sunday and soccer on a Saturday. And the registrations were quite high, $1,500 to play at Rochdale in this skills acquisition program. But then $300 to join with Carina Tigers. You get the bag, the jerseys, you get a season pass to the Broncos, which is a rugby league, so there's a bit of a difference there. So I think, and I think James Johnson has touched on it, and it's part of the sort of program of where we want to go, and to be able to help these kids with getting them to the club and playing the games that they love, because I feel sometimes the other codes are pinching our best talent, and just to show, like, I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago when we first spoke, and Indigenous make up 3% of the population here in Australia, and the incarceration levels here in Australia, they're just sitting above 30%. And if you have a look at the AFL and the NRL rosters, they make up, in each team, Indigenous make up nearly 7 to 8% in each team. So that just goes to show that sport is a connector, and it's a way to get out of where they're from and who they want to be. And unfortunately, in Australia, in soccer, we don't have, we've got our John Moriarty's and our Charlie Perkins, and we've got all these great things put in place, but we just don't have enough firepower in the Indigenous community to be able to see young kids to look up and be inspired by. So, but that's what we're working on at the moment. And I guess it's going to take a little while. And, I think forums like this as well, it's a great way to really, to show how passionate we are, from all walks of life, and football is the big connector.
Thanks, Jay. And good on you for starting your program Kicking with the Cuz too. I know it's something you fit around your day job and your life with your family, but obviously making a contribution to your community is hugely important. And please tell us how we can help with your efforts there, because I think you've got a lot of supporters on this call, judging by the chat that's going off. But I just want to touch on a couple of topics. You mentioned coaching at one point there, and I know we've got Glenn Worry on the call as well. I want to just mention diverse leadership. So coaches are a form of leaders. They're very powerful people in your life when you're a player, and to have diverse coaches, or to see the diversity of the community reflected in the leadership, and especially in coaching. How important is that, and what does it bring to the game? I might invite Shireen to make some comment on leadership and diversity first, and then invite Bruce and Jay to add anything if you want. I also want to touch after that on athlete activism a little bit, and because we're seeing a lot of that around the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we're going to go to some of the questions that have been pouring in on the chat line. So first of all, leadership, diversity and coaching. Shireen. Let's unmute you too. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. So much of the coaching, leadership, and diversity is tied together. I think if we look at the numbers, not just only in professional elite levels, if we look at numbers in grassroots, for example, like how many Black women do we have as coaches? Think about your recreational leagues or your leagues for youth. How many programs are run by other people who aren't white men? Quite frankly, let's look at it. Is there a way? And when we talk about football, I think it's also really important not to only just focus on playing. We need to also talk about coaching. We need to talk about officiating. We need to talk about other ways that, people can get involved, whether it's working at clubs. I love this idea. Somebody mentioned that there is Azmina is coaching and involved with a club. And I think that's really, really important, because we all won't be the stars. We all can't be Bruce and Jade. Okay, we all can't, but in star players on the pitch, but many of us can be involved in different levels. And I think that's key. There's more than one way to be involved in sport. And I see a lot of questions in the chat, like, how can we change this? But I want everyone to remember, and I'm so grateful to Bruce and Jade for doing this in practice and actionable steps. They start locally. They start at grassroots. And that's where the change begins. It's not going to happen overnight. It will happen incrementally. But when we start doing that, we start looking around at the communities around us and what they need. It's when we think about what soccer and what football is, it's a language. It's not just a sport. It's a connector of communities. I worked on a project when we had Syrian refugees land in Toronto in 2016, and they didn't speak any English, but they spoke football. And we were fine. The kids and I were fine. And I see this all over the world in different communities. I talk to different people and sports activists and coaches that are working. They don't care. At first, some of the kids were like, what is this lady in a hijab doing with us? But then they figure out pretty quickly, we have to strip away at the bit of sexism as well that's underlying. We have to do that also. But I think that this is a wonderful opportunity, but look around you. I mean, why don't you ask your local clubs, like, what's your percentage in commitment to hiring, in diverse practices in hiring? Who's on the executive boards? I mean, people keep asking, like, what do we do? There's many things we can do. You can start asking questions. Like, you really need to start asking. You, as a consumer of football, a supporter of football, a lover of football, you can ask these questions of your clubs. You can ask your teams where your youth play, your neighbors play, your kids play, you yourself play. What are we looking at? And when the applications are open, are they really open? Are they recommended? And we know how nepotism, come on, let's just be really candid here. We know how nepotism filters through the world of football. We all understand this and know this. It's going to go to someone's buddy or someone else's buddy. And that's really sometimes how the system works. But like, we can question this. You don't have to be a journalist. I mean, I know Sam's on this call, but not, you don't have to leave all the work up to all the journalists. Everybody can do this work. Just ask. And that's one of the ways that we can start tearing away. And there's something else I wanted to just note quickly. One of the things in terms of diversity and help and how people can do it, racism is a learned behavior. And it's a practice that children see and they mimic around them. And it grows into more. And if you don't think, in your heart you're not racist. I mean, I'm not a judge sitting here, and it's not like racialized people sit here and anoint who's racist or not. That's not how it works. We don't have time to do that. Too busy surviving. But I think the thing is that you need to act. We're beyond a time. Black Lives Matter is specific that we're beyond a time for pondering and inflection. It's time to get going now. We've had a lot of time to think. We need to move. And what you can do, one of the greatest allies known to sports history was Peter Norman. He was yours. And we hear a lot about what people can do. Peter Norman was huge, and his allyship and not centering himself in taking space away from Dr. John Carlos and Tommy Smith in '68. I mean, he suffered for it. He really did. But the stories about what he did were important. I mean, there's ways to not center yourself. And that's really important in terms of leadership. Find out if you know somebody who's trying to get into coaching, who's trying to get their kid into an elite program, what do they need? Do they need financial assistance? I mean, the Muslim community, I can tell you based on my research, one of the biggest barriers is equipment. You're not necessarily uniform accommodation, because that can happen, but equipment is a barrier. It's extremely expensive. And so what do people need? Find out. Take the lead from those people in those communities. So those are just some of the, yeah.
Thank you, Shireen, for that pep talk. Just in view of the time, and you did sort of touch on Black Lives Matter and athlete activism, but I do want to go to the questions now, so that we do have time to, because they've been piling in and we've had some absolute rippers of topics coming up. Julie Ryan has been monitoring the chat line and trying to group them into topics a little bit. So I'm going to throw to Julie, who's on the board of Women on Side, as is Bruce, by the way, in case you didn't know. But Julie, can you kick us off with the first sort of topic or group of questions that you've seen coming through the chat?
Yep. So we were looking, it's great to see the amount of, acknowledgement about how much of a responsibility all of us have to educate ourselves and be part of change. And that's become really relevant in the themes. Following on from the Black Lives Matter, a couple of the themes was about how can elite athletes expand on the moment. So we acknowledge that taking a knee and doing, wearing jerseys is very symbolic, but should they be doing anything at a deeper level? And is there other things that they can be doing outside of the game to highlight other issues, deaths in custody, those sort of things? And those questions, there were a couple of questions there, came from James Morrissey and Samantha Lewis. Apologies if I've shortened some of the questions there, but if we could throw to the panel for that.
Look, I think the athletes are doing a fantastic job, but I also think it's not up to the athletes to carry this burden alone. You know, you look at the historically, you know, not even that long ago, just a couple of years ago, athletes were getting fined for you know, taking a political stance against whatever that issue may have been. A lot of times around Black Lives Matter, a lot of times after someone's been shot by a policeman in the back or what have you. So I think it's more incumbent on the sports now. You know, the athletes are using their platform. I believe they're doing everything they can. And let's not forget, it's the athletes that take the majority of the burden in sport anyway. To carry this extra burden, you know, what else can they do? They're boycotting games. They're not going to tournaments. You know, they're pausing tournaments. They're taking knees. You know, people pay tens and hundreds of millions of dollars for some of these athletes to wear their logo, be it Nike, Adidas. Those athletes know the value and their worth, and they're putting, you know, some, you know, I can't breathe, you know, some different slogans on their shirts. There's high value in that. But I think it's incumbent on the hierarchy in the sports now and the administrators within the sport and the fans to really get on board as well, educate themselves and create policies that make a tangible difference. You know, I think the athletes, in my view, and being a former professional athlete, I think they've done all that they can, and they'll continue to do all that they can, because that's how you become an elite athlete in the first place. But it's incumbent on others within the sport, be it the fans, the hierarchy, boards, sports administrators, to really do something that creates a tangible difference within society.
Thanks, Bruce. I think it was well put I saw someone on Twitter quoting from a sports talk show, and they said, I don't want reporters going to press conference and saying to players, are you going to take a knee? I want reporters going to decision makers and saying, are you addressing the issues the players are taking a knee for? I can see Shireen Ahmed was rolling her eyes and busting her chops to say something, so I'm going to throw to you, Shireen, to respond.
No, I'm just agreeing emphatically with Bruce. I mean, I think there's something else that we need to recognize, whether it's NBA, whether it's WNBA, and we know that Black women have been on the forefront of this, and I'd like to remind everybody of that. And often every successful movement, that's where it begins. And the WNBA has been creating a blueprint for this kind of movement. Athletes are exhausted. In addition to high performance athletic, they're doing this. And I think that is mentally exhausting so many. A very good friend of mine who is the Black Girls Hockey Club, which is a prominent supporter club for Black women, that was started in the United States by Renee Haas. She tweeted out something that was very moving. She's like, we're exhausted. We're absolutely exhausted. And if you have friends who are from Indigenous and Black communities, when I said people are just trying to survive, police brutality and anti-Black violence is a real thing. It's not, oh, I'm just really tired today. It's generations of intergenerational trauma. It is living in a system that literally doesn't function. And people are saying, what do we do? Well, you've heard the talks, you've been to the webinars, you've seen the tweets, there's action plans, there's Black Lives Matter, link trees, cards that you can use, that you can listen to. And now, instead of looking to the athletes or even asking Black athletes how they feel, what about asking white teammates? What are they doing? Ask the white teammate, are you taking a knee? Are you going to support your teammates? The amount of questions getting put to Black athletes is one thing. And I mean, they're wearing shirts that say, I can't breathe, whether it's George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. Like, ask the allies. And we've seen this in multiple sports arenas around the world. And in Australia, you have a women's team that mobilizes and have done things. You have an AFL, which has a very diverse participation. Like, I mean, I've seen many racialized players in those spaces, and that's heartwarming. But I think we need to keep focused on this as well. Like Bruce, everything Bruce said, I just want to take a highlighter and just say yes, yes, yes to all of it.
Yep. The follow-up question, or the expanded question with that, was also about the main point of the theme was what the organisations can do, was just highlighting the athletes, but what do we feel the organisations should be doing to address that, including the media, including the sports organisation, especially elite Australian sport, was the other question.
Hire Black people. It's not difficult. Hire Black women. They're smart. They're capable. Hire them. I mean, I don't need to say a lot here.
Yep. So the other question we had then from Nikki Bowman, which follows into that, was about, she was asking our panel, do you feel that Australian governance in a lot of sports reflects the multiracial nature of the game, and how do we broaden that inclusion even in that space, in the governance space?
I think me personally, being involved with football in Australia, I think, me looking at other codes, I think the AFL and the NRL do it very, very well. And for an example, you know, it was back in 2016, and my work that I was doing in the community, you know, with my Kicking with the Cars football program, being out and about with other charities and what have you. I got nominated as, well, I ended up winning the NAIDOC Sportsperson of the Year, which is one of the most prestige in individual honours that you can win. It's a bit of sport and community involvement, and they've got all different. So you've got your sport, entertainment, all these other different categories. And you know, I think I was there with, there was Adam Goods, I think Mundine, and there was a couple of other sports people. And I was going to up to the Northern Territory, and I had no idea I was up against all these other finals. I knew who I was up against, but I didn't know I was going to end up taking this award. And, you know, it was funny because, you know, here I was playing for the A-League with the Socceroos, but nobody in the football community knew that I was about to get this award, or going to get it. And had that been Michael O'Loughlin, Adam Goods in AFL, Jonathan Thurston, Greg Inglis in NRL, that would have been all over the social media, all over the platforms. But it's just funny, that just shows you that, you know, we still got a long way to go with football in this country. And I just see the other codes, and I'm not trying to bring our code down here by any means, but I just think we've got a long way of inclusion and other, you know, nationalities and bringing us all together. And yeah, it's just something that sits with me, because it's one of my best achievements. You know, I've played captain of Socceroos, I've won titles, but that there is a individual award that, you know, no one can take that away from me. It's something that's going to be close to my heart, you know, for the rest of my life. And like I go back before, you know, if it had been someone else in another code, even cricket or whatever it may be, they would have been recognised and you know, put on a, you know, this is what we're doing. This is our player. You know, let's, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to make myself whatever it is, but you know, it's just a message that I want to be able to say, that we've still got a little bit to go.
Thanks, Jade. It was a massive achievement in 2016, and football was proud of you. But yeah, I agree that we don't get certainly as much media space as our colleagues in other codes. But I do want to, I've got one eye on the clock here because we're running right to the end of our time. I want to note that Rachel Davis, who's the chair of FIFA's Human Rights Advisory Board, is on this call, and she's tossed a question into the chat about what's the most important thing FIFA could do to help this. So in closing, I want to ask all three of the panelists, what are the most important points of action that you would like people on this call to take away? You have some pretty big hitters on this call, actually, and thank you so much for all dialing in. We've got people from all parts of football. There's players, there's people who represent coaches, there's people who are on boards, on committees. There are human rights lawyers and Olympians. I think Nikki Dryden was on the call. People in administration, and you've got the chair of the Human Rights Advisory Board in FIFA saying, what's the most important thing you'd like FIFA to do around human rights and racism? So can I throw to each one of you in turn for a quick sum up of what you'd like this group to take away by way of action from today?
I'll start. I think you got the blunt instruments, which I don't think FIFA, UEFA, and other bodies use enough, or use effectively enough, and that's sanctions. I think the sanctions are very light. You know, it's not enough of the sanctions aren't heavy enough to be a deterrent when it comes to racist abuse of players, especially on the football field. That's the short-term blunt tool that can suppress you know, some of these issues, but I think longer term it's about education. It all comes down to education for me, and it's about, you know, implementing legitimate, you know, tangible educational programs that have the capacity to give real outcomes, you know, and that's not a policy piece written up by a bunch of, you know, well-to-do bureaucrats somewhere in the Swiss Alps. You know, I'm talking about, you got to get people, you need those people, but, you know, I'd say equally important, you need former players who have experienced racism. You need sporting administrators from a variety of different backgrounds. You can get some Iranian women who might be able to tell you what it's like not being able to go and watch a game in their home country. You know, you need a diverse group of people that can give their input into what an educational program needs to provide. You know, what are the outcomes we're going to achieve by implementing this educational program. And then, you know, you could create something that you give to all the member federations around the world, or you know, or there's an incident and you deploy it there in a way that the athletes will see that there's something happening. The sports administrators can implement it. You know, the people in the member federations can implement it across staff, and then it just sort of trickles down. I think that's the longer term sort of goal and aim, but for me it's about educational programs, which there isn't one. I think the racism, it stops with me, give it a red card, like all that stuff's sort of good, sort of, you know, you spend a bit of money, a bit of marketing, you know, you get the message out, you start the conversation. But if you want tangible change, because all those things haven't worked in the past, I'd say greater sanctions, you keep on the, you know, racism, it stops with me, and you get the ambassadors, the Drogbas of the world and that to be ambassadors for that, people listen. But it's the educational programs. That's got to be the medium to longer term solution.
Jade, do you want to add anything with your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I can only follow on like what Bruce was saying there. But for me, again, it's about education, and I guess you know, the hierarchies within an organisation or your local club or teachers at school. I think that's the now. And then the kids are the future. So, you know, there's a bit of we have to act on it now. And how would we do that? Like, again, sport is a connector, and you see some of these players in the NBA at the moment, some of them are nearly bigger than the club themselves. So, and that just goes to show that they can stop a whole organization because everybody watches sport. So I think we as athletes, we have a big role to play, and especially in our communities and where we're from. And I think, like Bruce said, and Sharina, it's the same. It's all about education coming together and how we implement this education process. Because me looking back at the Adam Goodes problem going back years ago when he was getting booed for 17 games straight, you know, not at the Sydney Swans, but every away game. That nearly went for 2 years, I think, a year and a half. And, you know, nothing happened. You know, you're talking about top people from Channel 9 were jumping in on being part of the problem, and instead of being a solution to the problem. And you had one of our best players in the AFL's ever seen getting booed at every game that he went, every home game. And he didn't want to go. And if no one knows from the other side of the world, AFL, you know, when you retire, you get to do the lap of honour at the MCG, and it's a recognition of who you are and what you contributed to the AFL. And he didn't want to go in front of 90,000 people to say, hey, I'm an Indigenous person, but I'm an AFL person and I've contributed to this game. in Australia and done my community and everyone proud, and he didn't want to go to that. So that in itself was really, really sad. And I just can't believe us as Australian people didn't act on that and to try and implement change and education at that time. So for me, again, we've still got a long way to go.
Thanks, Jade. Shireen, your turn.
This isn't specifically for FIFA, but I think I keep seeing a lot of whenever I do these panels of what can we do, what can we do? Well, the thing is, there's no magic solution, and I think that's really important for everybody to understand. There's no magic potion that you get and you put it on and then we've alleviated systemic racism. It's at every level, like Bruce is talking about. It's in every piece. It's parents on the sideline. It's the youth players. It's in the exec boardrooms. I keep saying hire women. Like my solution for different things is hire women, hire Black women, hire Black people, hire racialized folks. And the reason I keep saying this is because they're not there. They're not there. And I think it's really important to understand, like, take the lead of other places. FIFA can follow the example of the WNBA, create a social justice committee. Why not? They're one of the first professional sports organizations to do it. I mean, you know, like, I think that we can't leave everything to Raheem Sterling to battle the media and Marcus Rashford. It's got to be more people doing this. And I think that that idea of a social justice committee is not, it's not difficult. It's people are afraid of what they don't know, and giving amplification and voices to people who have voices, they're just not amplified. I don't like to consider people as voiceless. I take issue with that. I think everybody has agency. Arundhati Roy has said that people are just preferably unheard. They're not voiceless. Give them an opportunity. The other thing is let communities lead you. Let them tell you what they need. We don't need white savior mentality of people to come in here and be like, we need to do this and this and this and this. That's not how it works. Let communities, particularly Black ones, Indigenous communities, tell you what they need. They have leaders. 2 of them are on this panel, and we're honored to be among them. Let them, you know, teach, mentor other people, and let them raise them up. I say this often, and it's quite blunt, and my apologies for it, but give us the money and get out of the way. To be quite honest with you, let us create those programs. Let us focus it on those kids. Let us give it to racialized girls. Let's give it to young Black communities, and let's see it rise up. We need less talking, and sort of, if that's the least you can do is give money. And as far as FIFA goes, like, I mean, I could write an article for The Guardian about it, perhaps, about what you can do. But, you know, I think the other thing is that start in terms of listening. We need to be less defensive and less posturing. I don't necessarily think that, like, changing Black Lives Matter on the pitch to let's end racism. What, no room for racism is the new tagline. I just give money, listen to people, and again, question everything. You have the power to question. So do.
Thank you, Shireen, for your rousing finish there. I mean, I think we all have a sphere of influence, right? I mean, there are a lot of influential people on this call, but everybody on this call has a sphere of influence, whether it's their club or their church group or their circle of friends, their team, their teammates. You can be that ally, and you can be that person who listens, learns, reflects, and doesn't stand by, but stands up to combat the systemic forces of racism that we see. I hope this webinar has been part of us all being able to listen and learn and reflect. And I want to thank each of the panelists for the thoughts that they've shared with us, the perspectives, and enabling us to learn. I think this space is sometimes a difficult one to be a place of learning. It's often a place of judgment, and people are fearful of judgment. They feel like, you know, the politically correct brigade is going to come after them. And I truly think that it's conversations like this that enable people to open their ears, to understand. And I hope that you're all able to take something away from this that will help you be able to do the same throughout your circle of influence. So thank you to Women on Side for allowing me to moderate this morning on as a late up off the bench, to our 3 guests who've been extraordinary, to our backroom angels who've helped make this happen, and to Women on Side, which is an Australia-wide network dedicated to making football a place for women to thrive. We formed in July 2017 to promote gender equality in football, and specifically to partake in the Congress and constitutional review of FFA to ensure that FIFA's gender reforms could be adopted into that. As a result, we now have a 40-40-20 rule in FFA and a 50-50 board on gender split. We're now a diverse network of women in football with various interest groups covering coaching, refereeing, governance, fans and others. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with FFA, the Women's Council, the FCA and other groups to help develop our beautiful game. So thank you again for joining. I hope that this has been a place of learning and reflection for you. And thank you again to our panellists for generously providing their time, and to all of you for your engagement through the chat and through joining us today. Thank you.